G'day. You might notice that this is not the usual Railnatter Scottish accent, and I'm not Gareth.
It's true, he isn't.
I'm Chris Brownbill. You might remember me from such shows as Railnatter episodes 265 and 271. I'm also creator of the Australian Rail Maps website. Gareth deserves a well-earned break once in a while, and this week is one of those once-in-a-whiles. But like all good railways, Railnatter must go on. So today, I'm your Railnatter replacement bus. Welcome to Australia, and welcome to Railnatter.
And as the Intercity 225 fades away, Chris Brownbill, thank you so much for putting this together. We are talking about Melbourne, and this is a very brief intro before I hand back to Chris to take things away. Yes, we're talking about Melbourne, down here in the very southern bit of Australia. Look at this big old funny shaped island, isn't it beautiful? Yes, Chris's two previous episodes were brilliant. I enjoyed them very much, and you should go back and listen to them if you haven't already. The reason this episode is coming out is because I'm down doing politics and rail in London. But the other reason is because this Sunday, Melbourne's Crossrail essentially is opening, and it's extremely exciting, and it's a good chance for people to think a little about how Melbourne's public transport is actually quite brilliant in lots of ways. Much potential, of course, but this project is pretty fantastic with some really fantastic architecture, which Chris will bring up and touch on later on in the episode. He's had a wander around some of the stations in advance of them opening this weekend. So plenty of bits and pieces in here for you. This is a little feast at Chris's pace, and it's a delight and a joy. And it's a delight to have you watching it while I gallivant about, and you get something very different tonight, but hopefully something enjoyable. Before we do that, though, I have to remind you, as I will at the end of the episode, if you're a PWI member, you need to vote to make sure that the Permanent Way Institution changes its name to become the Railway Engineering Institution. You will have an email that you can click on the link to go and vote. If you're a member, please do it. It is so important that we get, particularly our younger membership, to get involved and vote. Please go and do it. Also, yes, I am telling you how to vote, but that's the PWI may be a democracy. Railnatter is not. Although the shreds of democracy we have are via the Patreon. Particularly if you're a £5 and above Patreon supporter, there should be a bonus tonight from me live in London talking about electrification. So have fun with that at 21:30-ish. Patreon.com/Gareth Dennis. It's you lovely Patreon people that make the show happen. Back to Chris.
Today, I'm in Melbourne. There are many great things about this city. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, some of the world's best preserved Victorian-era localities, great coffee, museums, concerts, and more. But you lot aren't interested in any of that. This is Railnatter. You want trains. And by God, that's what you'll get. So today I'll show you around some of the quirky, nerdy, and esoteric rail-adjacent things to be found in this city. Let's start right here at Flinders Street Station. Not only is it a major rail hub, it's where modern Australian railways arguably began in 1854. Meet you under the clocks has long been a catchphrase for Melburnians meeting friends in the city. And whilst the clocks are remnants of a much less automated era, they're still here, protected by historic listing. A few of the destinations are now out of date, with train services having since been extended beyond St Albans, Altona and Broadmeadows. And some lines don't even have a clock, because those lines originally departed from their own separate station at Princes Bridge on the other side of the street. So where will we meet to start this episode? Let's meet under the clocks. That's clocks, I said, clocks, with an L. Today's Flinders Street Station building is also something of a tourist attraction. This flamboyant Edwardian Baroque-style building replaced the earlier building in 1909. It has multiple entrances, with a clock tower facing one city intersection and a domed entrance opening onto perhaps the most famous intersection in the city. The building even has a grand ballroom. It hasn't seen any dancing since 1983 and is not normally now open to the public, but it is occasionally used as an exhibition space. and there are hopes that it will one day be restored to its former glory. The first steam train to carry paying passengers anywhere in Australia departed from this very spot on the 12th of September 1854 for the 10-minute trip over the 4-kilometre long broad gauge line to Sandridge. It pulled away from somewhere here, then ran over the river to the left. Whilst the last train on that line departed in 1987, the majority of the line from just beyond that vertical house of sin does still see rail transport, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Flinders Street Station is today a very busy station with 12 platforms seeing broad gauge electric trains depart on 17 different suburban lines operated by Melbourne Metro, which, for the record, is not a metro. It's a suburban rail network. And there's also one long-distance non-electrified passenger line that runs through here, and it's run by V-Line. I know I said I'd stick to things of railway interest, and I will. And this next thing is a little bit different, but it's kind of relevant. And to see it, we have to leave the station and take a short walk into the city to find a shopping mall. Melbourne is famous for its laneways, which are bustling with activity and are in many ways the lifeblood of the city. A block and a half from Flinders Street Station is Howie Place. It's nowhere near the busiest or most attractive laneway, but it has a curious link to UK railways. The block of land here was bought by Henry Howie in 1837. It was inherited by his brother John Howie, and then eventually his son, Captain John Edwards Presgrave Howie. Now, J.E.P. Howie oversaw the construction of the Presgrave building, which takes his name. So what, you might ask? Well, the railway link is that Captain J.E.P. Howie was a British eccentric millionaire motor racing driver with a penchant for railways. Apart from this Melbourne City block, he's best known as the person who built the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch narrow gauge railway along the coast of Kent in the UK. If only he'd built a 15-inch gauge railway around here too. Oh well. But enough of this, let's go back to Flinders Street Station and hop on a train and go for a ride. There's fairly decent level boarding here. It's not always this good around the network. There are some older stations with larger horizontal and vertical gaps, but this key station is okay. There are 4 different types of electric train on Melbourne's network and a 5th currently in testing. They range from 1980s locally built ComEng sets through to the new Chinese-built high-capacity metro trains, HCMTs, which have been built over the past few years for the new metro tunnel, which is due to open within weeks. All trains on the network are broad gauge and draw 1500 volts DC from overhead catenary. This particular train, and the one on the track next to us, are Alstom Extrapolis 100s. They are members of 106 strong 6-car sets built between 2002 and 2020. There are 5 stations in the downtown central business district. In addition to Flinders Street, there is Southern Cross, which is the main long-distance station, and we'll come back to that later, plus 3 stations on the City Loop: Flagstaff, Melbourne Central and Parliament. The City Loop is a 4-track underground section of railway, with each of the 3 stations having 4 platforms on 2 levels. Together with the pre-existing stations, these provide access to the metro network from every side of the central business district. Melbourne Central is the busiest of the underground stations and is the 3rd busiest on the network, behind only Flinders Street and Southern Cross. Though despite what its name might lead you to believe, it's not really any more central to the network than any other station. It's actually named after a retail shopping centre through which you have to walk to enter and leave the station. Like the other City Loop stations, it has a peak 1980s vibe. It's starting to look just a bit grotty nowadays, but it does the job and does it well. Let's leave the central business district now and have a look at some older inner urban stations. I'm at West Richmond, just 2 stops away from the CBD. It's in a relatively secluded location, tucked away from road traffic on a side street in what is a largely residential area. It's a little unusual in being built on a curve, and it has a tunnel portal at one end, both of which make it a pleasant spot for train watching. Not very far away, but on a different line altogether, is Burnley Station. Yes, there are many stations on the Melbourne network that have names that will be familiar to British people. Burnley is 3 stations east of the city in a mixed commercial, residential and industrial area. Its 4 platforms are sited at a major junction, where the 4 tracks from the city branch into the 2-track Glen Waverley line and the 3-track trunk route for the Lilydale, Belgrave and Alamein lines. South Yarra is also just 2 stations from the city, but it's a little further south, 5 kilometres out, and it's on different lines once again. It's a larger 6-platform station and is where the 2-track Sandringham line diverges from the 4 tracks which carry the Frankston and Pakenham-Cranbourne lines. A little further south, down the Sandringham line, this time 10 kilometres and 6 stations from the central city, is Ripponlea. Whilst this railway line opened in 1859, Ripponlea Station was a later addition, opening in 1912. It's in a different style to the other inner city stations from earlier decades, with the buildings being in the Federation style, which is Australia's take on arts and crafts architecture. Ripponlea is a primarily residential area, although the station's conveniently located for the local shopping street, which starts with a coffee shop right as you exit the platform. It is also, though, where we see our first example of something that unfortunately defines Melbourne's train network: level crossings. Melbourne's metropolitan train network has 222 stations over 405 route kilometres of broad gauge track, electrified at 1500 volts DC. Despite a handful of grade separation projects in the 1950s, a couple in the 80s and 90s, and a few in the early 2010s, by 2014 there were still 176 road level crossings across the network. Not only are they noisy for nearby residents and inconvenient for motorists, they're dangerous. Here, for example, at North Brighton Station, 2 stations south of Ripponlea, where there is a level crossing immediately at the down end of the platforms, the speed of arriving trains is limited because they have a red light until the booms are fully lowered, when a green signal can only then be displayed. Of course, it's not only train speed that is limited. Level crossings also act as a political brake on increasing train frequency, because the more trains, the more bells, the more boom downtime there is to frustrate motorists. And we must not anger carboys. But it's not easy to remove crossings at places like Middle Brighton, where the station is so tightly integrated into the local retail shopping area, and where there is strong local sentiment to preserve the character of the place. As an aside, many years ago, that restaurant there, right next to the tracks, was a specialist seafood place, and it was delightfully named Fish Plate. I appreciated the quality pun, but I wonder how many locals even knew how appropriate the name was given its railway-adjacent location. The problem of level crossings gets perhaps even worse as we get further away from the city, where even multi-lane arterial roads with higher speeds limits cross railways on the level. Let's head out in the opposite direction, 11 kilometres north of the city on the Upfield line, to a place named Batman. Yes, Batman. It's nothing to do with the Cape Crusader, though. This place is named for John Batman, one of the first Europeans to settle in what would become Melbourne. In fact, in 1837, there was serious consideration given to naming Melbourne Batmania, which would have been quite something. But it's for the best that didn't happen, because John Batman was described even by a contemporary as a rogue, cheat, thief, liar, a murderer of blacks, and the vilest man I have ever known. So the less said about him the better, and quite frankly, we ought to rename this station. But back to railway stuff. Gaffney Street here is nothing special, and Batman Station itself is pretty ordinary too. But it's a good example of what bog-standard middle suburban stations on Melbourne's train network were like a couple of decades ago. But then came the LXRP. The Level Crossing Removal Program, or LXRP, was established by the Victorian State Government in 2015 with an objective of removing and grade separating 110 level crossings and of rebuilding 51 railway stations by the year 2030. As of now, 87 crossings have been removed and 48 stations have been completely rebuilt. In many ways, whilst LXRP has received its social licence as being investment to reduce road traffic delays, perhaps its greatest value will be in replacing clapped-out stations with new modern facilities. So let's go and have a look at some of these new generation stations. Whilst the first 9 rebuilt stations delivered by LXRP in 2016 and 17 were built below ground level, on tracks sunk to pass beneath roads, the project really hit its straps in 2018 when it delivered 10 elevated stations, 7 of which were replacements of old ground level stations, plus there were 3 all-new stations on a new line extension. Murrumbeena is a suburb 14.5 kilometres southeast of the city centre. The name's derived from an indigenous word that, according to one interpretation, means belonging to you, which is very appropriate. The station is 9 stops from the city centre on the Cranbourne and Pakenham lines, and it's also the trunk main line to the Gippsland region of eastern Victoria. The railway through here was elevated in 2018 to eliminate many level crossings, and Murrumbeena is the middle one of 3 consecutive newly built stations. I like the wraparound station roof, and the facilities at these stations are light years ahead of what came before. And of course the level crossing is now gone, although a signalised pedestrian and cycle crossing is now in its place, leading to the linear park, path and community space that now runs beneath the new elevated railway. Construction of the new elevated sections of railway was a major civil engineering task, and it did involve significant disruption to train services. However, they were able to maintain services for as long as possible by building overhead whilst the trains ran underneath. This photo was taken at Murrumbeena Station in 2018, just days before the last trains ran on the old ground level tracks. A further 6 elevated stations were built in 2019-20, although most of these to different designs, such as this one at Coburg in the northern suburbs. These stations have lifts, but unlike the earlier builds, no escalators. And up top they have side platforms rather than island platforms, and there is no roof over the tracks. 11 more stations were rebuilt in 2021-22 with a mix of elevated and sunken stations, with some of the elevated stations, such as this at Bell, being built to the same basic design as at Coburg. It was quiet when I visited Bell on a Sunday afternoon, but you can see these new stations have plenty of scope to handle large crowds. I particularly like the way the area around the stations has been opened up and the art installations add to it too. It's a new public space that better links the communities on each side of the line that were once divided by the ground level railway. And I love the visual pun with the overhead bridges forming a bell at Bell. And as a bit of a contrast, here is Union Station in the eastern suburbs, 11 stations from the city, and built new in 2023 to replace 2 closely spaced former ground level stations at Surrey Hills and Mont Albert. This is on the crest of a hill, so it made sense to dig down rather than to elevate the line. But even so, whilst the trench does still divide the 2 sides of the line, a new pedestrian-only bridge provides a new public plaza. And I like the way the building from the old Mont Albert station has been retained and reused here. Closure of 2 stations to be replaced by 1 caused a bit of rivalry between advocates of the 2 older stations, but the name chosen for the new station, Union, was a clever compromise. It not only symbolises the union of the 2 former stations, but it does describe the area as it's the name of one of the 2 roads from which a level crossing was removed. Although I suppose visiting North Americans might be confused to find that it's nothing like a central city terminal station. And to top it all off, a new 9-kilometre long twin-bore underground line, known as the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, is due to open before the end of 2025. This runs beneath the city centre and will connect lines from the southeast with those from the northwest, freeing up capacity in the city loop to improve service frequency on many lines. These images were taken on public open days I was able to attend at 3 of the 5 new stations. 2 of those 5 stations will effectively be additional platforms for Flinders Street and Melbourne Central stations, and there will be 3 new stations in high demand areas until now never served by trains.
Oh, what a delightful first half of the show. Very briefly, dear Patreon supporters, in the £5 and above tier, you can watch tonight's bonus, which will be probably at 21:30 or possibly a little bit later. You will know if you're in the Patreon because I will drop a message in there and you'll get your ping. And it'll be me wandering around somewhere in that there London that they have ranting about electrification because I'm extremely angry about it and you should be too. Anyway, Chris is going to bring us back to some lovely railway action indeed. We're moving on to the trams bit. So, Chris, take it away.
So that's a necessarily brief look at trains. But there's no doubt that it's the trams for which Melbourne is better known. The city has what is today the world's largest electric tram system, with 520 trams running on 24 routes over 250 kilometres of double track. And that's something of which Melburnians are justifiably proud. Many Australian cities once had tram networks, but apart from just one lone surviving route in Adelaide, like so many other places in the Anglosphere, Australian cities ripped up their tram tracks in the 1950s and 1960s. But not in Melbourne. Why? Well, the great man theory credits Major General Sir Robert Risson, decorated veteran of many World War II North Africa campaigns and head of the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board for 21 years, with applying his military experience to heroically defend the tram empire against the invading bus army. And it's true that his strong leadership, with an almost fanatical dedication to standardisation, frequency, maintenance and cost containment, definitely made the common refrain of "rattly old trams must go" ineffective in Melbourne. But in truth, it was probably as much about luck as anything else. From 1885, Melbourne had built up a large network of cable tramways, influenced heavily by San Francisco. In fact, it was the world's largest cable tram network. These were built in an era of immense wealth in Melbourne, deriving from the gold mined across the state of Victoria, which may actually have also built the links with San Francisco. The cable tramways were so well built that they all lasted into the 1920s, by which time Melbourne cable tram technology had been surpassed by electric traction. And every other city in the nation of any significance, as well as many outer suburban municipalities of Melbourne, had their own electric tram networks. So, a program of wholesale replacement of cable trams with new electric trams was commenced. This continued into the 1930s, and whilst by the 30s and into 1940 the mood had changed and the last remaining cable lines were replaced by petrol buses instead of electric trams, the legacy was that Melbourne's electric tram tracks and the fleet was 10 to 20 years newer than most other cities' networks. And by the time the post-World War II assault on trams arrived, Melbourne was well equipped to defend itself. Another piece of luck was Melbourne's hosting of the 1956 Olympic Games, which not only distracted attention, it also enabled Risson to justify building a new electric tram line along the central city street of Bourke Street to replace the buses, which had replaced the last cable line in 1940. A brand new tram line and fleet of trams in the mid-1950s saw the city through until the early 1970s, by which time a bold fleet and network renewal plan was funded by the state government, and Melbourne's trams were here to stay. There have been a handful of route closures over the decades, but 95% or so of the network remains, and there have been numerous extensions, meaning the network is now larger than it has ever been at any time in history. In 1987, two short railways, including that original one from Flinders Street to Sandridge, were converted to tramways. And it's in this way that rail vehicles do still today run on the majority of that first 1854 line. Trams are, though, predominantly an inner-city and middle suburban network, but it complements the train network quite well, as that is probably more focused on the middle to outer suburbs. I won't get into the weeds of all the tram classes or routes, we'd be here for weeks, but I thought I'd catch a tram to just 3 or 4 special places. On board here, we are travelling south on Route 64. Melbourne is not only the world's largest tram network, it's also the most southerly regular public transport, that is, non-museum or tourist tram network, anywhere in the world. And this East Brighton terminus of Route 64 is the southernmost point. So this exact section of track and those unremarkable poles acting as the buffer stop at 37 degrees 54 minutes 51 seconds south are effectively holding up the entire world of public transport tramways. And look which tram shows up while I'm here. It's Totty, Tram of the Year. It happens only rarely, but it's a good day when we're graced by Totty. Of course, she'll only be Totty for a few more weeks, and then on January the 1st, Tony will transition into Totty, which maybe just adds credence to those who believe trams really are trams. There are too many tram junctions in Melbourne to count, but my favourite is Balaclava Junction. As we bid Totty farewell for now, here is Australia's only Grand Union Tram Junction. Not only does it have double tracks running through on each cross street, it has double track curves on each corner, meaning trams can travel from any direction to any other direction. And finally, the piece de resistance, well, I'm sure there are resistors here somewhere, there is Kooyong. Kooyong is possibly known to sports aficionados as the former site of the Australian Open Tennis Championship, Australia's Wimbledon if you like, and that's the tennis club right there. But we're here to see this. It's one of 2 surviving tram train level crossings. These things are incredible examples of engineering. Yes, they're noisy and slow everything down, and like all level crossings, they're dangerous. But for lovers of mechanical tech, they're beautiful. They're no museum pieces though. This is a busy roadway, busy tramway, and a busy railway. The railway is broad gauge and the tramway is standard gauge, making the crossing rectangular rather than square. And the differing voltages, 1500 volts DC for trains and 600 volts DC for trams, means that a complex switching and interlocking mechanism controlled by the manual signal box ensures that not only the lights and booms for road traffic are synchronised with railway signals and train stops, but that the correct voltage is supplied to the overhead in the square. Note also the cantilevered boom arms necessary to avoid fouling the tramway overhead wires. There's so much more that could be said, but too much of a good thing and all that. But we really need to finish off at Melbourne's primary long-distance station, Southern Cross. Known as Spencer Street Station until it was completely rebuilt in 2005, this is a Metro network station, but its primary role is the terminus for long-distance diesel trains run by V-Line. V-Line's the government-run passenger rail operator that runs diesel trains on 8 routes out of Melbourne into regional Victoria, connecting Melbourne to provincial cities and towns. 7 of those lines are broad gauge, but 1 is standard gauge. And this dual gauge track in platforms 1 and 2 is a signifier of that perennial curse of Australian railways. Standard gauge railways are still uncommon in Melbourne. Only 2 of the 17 platform faces at Southern Cross have standard gauge track, and V-Line's standard gauge trains are prominently labelled as such. That signal box, once known as Spencer Street No. 1 box, once controlled access to the terminal station and once housed a 192-lever mechanical frame. In the years prior to its 2008 decommissioning, it was the world's largest operational mechanical frame. Of course, it's only because it was decommissioned that Shrewsbury in the UK now can claim that record. You can thank us later. Southern Cross is also terminus for standard gauge interstate trains to Adelaide and Sydney. So yes, you can even catch an XPT to Sydney from here. But that, as they say in the classics, is a story for another day.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, a very quick reminder, Chris's 2 episodes, both well worth going and having a little look through. A last reminder, go vote to make the PWI actually have a good name. We don't lose that wonderful legacy of firstly the logo, but also the name. We don't lose the legacy. We don't shred it. We don't put it on a bonfire or anything, but we have a name that allows us to actually do what we need to do for the railways much more easily. So go and vote. And it only remains for me to say, on behalf of Chris, on the other side of the planet, and from me, gallivanting about the place, speaking politics for the young rail professional folks, hosting their London Politics and Rail event. Have a good evening. Take very good care of yourselves, and cheerio.